Welcome to part 2. Could it be any other way? Consider a replay of the original thought experiment. But this time, nobody has a gun. The ship was filled exclusively with civilized, reasonable people. So when they arrive on the beach, instead of fighting, they have a meeting to decide how they will distribute the land. Using what we learnt in the first video, can we construct a fairer mechanism? It seems likely that the solution could involve money, i.e. people that wanted nicer plots of land would somehow have to pay more. But we immediately run into a problem. Who would they pay money to? Nobody owns any land. Well, actually, to say that nobody owns any land isn't quite true. One could easily argue that in fact everybody owns all of the island equally. So if we think back to the principle developed with the scarf story in the last video, that the sale of something can only be fair so long as everyone with a claim to it is being compensated, it leads to the inevitable conclusion that if someone wants exclusive rights to a plot of land, then they should pay compensation equally to everyone else. On first hearing, this idea sounds a little crazy, but bear with me while we consider A, how this can be done, and B, what are the consequences of doing things this way. Now before we continue, we need to consider a choice. Should people's payments be for people to rent land from everyone else, or to purchase it? The arguments around this are rather complicated, and for the moment, let's just consider renting. We'll come back to the idea of purchasing later. So here's how it can be done. The islanders could instigate a company whose job it was to divide up the island into small plots and rent out each plot to the person willing to pay the highest rent for that plot. Let's call it Desert Island Land Rental Limited. The company would be owned by all the islanders, and so the total of each month's collected rent would be distributed equally to all the inhabitants in the form of a dividend. Let us imagine that when all the plots had been rented out, the average rent turned out to be 100 island dollars per month. Notice that any islanders who rent an exactly average size plot of land will effectively get their land for free. This is because what they pay in rent will exactly be matched by the dividend payments from the company. This in fact makes perfect sense. If everyone just happened to want exactly the same quantity and quality of land as everyone else, then there would be no need for any money to change hands at all. Next, let's consider a wealthier islander that wants a deluxe plot of land. Say it's one of the biggest plots and in the best location. This person will have to pay a much higher rent than average, but will only get the same size dividend as everyone else. The net effect being that they will have to pay for their land. They are essentially paying the rest of the islanders compensation for not having access to this deluxe plot. Now let's consider the fate of someone that chooses to live on a smaller than average plot of land at the undesirable end of the island. Their rent will be very low, of course, but the dividend payments will be the same size as everyone else. So their net land rent will be negative. Surely some mistake. But think about it for a moment. By living on a smaller than average plot of land, you are enabling everyone else to have more. Another way to think of it is to consider that the people living on smaller patches of land are in fact acting as micro-landlords. They have chosen not to use their full equitable share of land, but instead to live on a fraction of it and rent out the remainder to other islanders. The system isn't mad at all. It's perfectly logical, and of course, fair. The idea of a dividend payment being paid to all citizens equally is not new. Thomas Paine wrote about the idea of taxing landowners in order to distribute the proceeds equally to the entire population as far back as 1797, and discussions of similar ideas can be traced back to around 500 BC. Some of you may be thinking that this is all perfectly logical, but it all seems too radical to ever be accepted by the general public. But history has shown that these kinds of ideas can become popular. Take the case of Henry George. He understood that land was really the property of the population as a whole. His plan was to use the money collected from land ownership as a way to pay for government, instead of income tax. In 1879, he wrote a book called Progress and Poverty, explaining his ideas. The book sold millions of copies, and is one of the biggest selling economics books in history. He became so famous but when he died, an estimated 100,000 people attended his funeral. Admirers of his work included Winston Churchill and Albert Einstein. The argument that income from land should be shared can be applied equally to other natural resources, for example oil. Indeed, sharing oil revenue equally amongst a population is being practiced in modern-day Alaska, where residents have been receiving an oil dividend of over $1,000 per year. So ideas based on the principles outlined in this video can indeed become popular given the right presentation, and can be adopted in practice in the real world. So far we have seen that the current land ownership system is unjust, and we have presented a simple outline of a better way of doing things. There are, however, still some unanswered questions, like what happens if we wish to buy rather than rent? And how is the land rental idea affected by having houses built on the land? And how can we make the transition from our current system to a fairer one? In the final video, we will address these issues.